This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Roger Scruton his latest book on human nature. Roger Scruton certainly needs no introduction. This is now his fourth appearance on Liberty Law Talk, and he is an immense writer. He writes on politics, morality, beauty, architecture, music, pretty much everything that human beings want to understand at a deep level. He can tell you about it. And Roger, we are delighted to have you on the program today to discuss this book.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here on the program.
So, Roger, thinking about the book on human nature, it seems to me, from my vantage point, there are two contradictory understandings of the human person that one finds educated classes in the West articulate. And I think this relates to your book. On the one hand, we're told evolutionary biology, evolutionary concepts are completely sufficient to help us understand who we are as human beings. There is nothing we do that is not explainable ultimately by some sort of adaptation, factual understanding. And then these same people, without missing a beat, will then assert in the next breath that we are emancipated, autonomous individuals, completely free to do what we will, so long as we don't hurt another person. Roger, help us understand. Am I right in this observation? And are these things as contradictory as I think? How did we get to this point?
Well, it's a very interesting observation. It is true that there's a kind of contradiction here. Obviously, to say that we're completely free to live as we want, provided we do no harm, is the fundamental libertarian, liberal doctrine. But, when you live in that way, you are apt to feel guilty as well, and you need excuses. And the best possible excuse is that that you're simply an evolutionarily determined organism. That actually you couldn't help it. That you were bound to be this way because that's the way you've been made by your physical makeup. So don't worry that by living freely, you also do all kinds of things that you wouldn't otherwise have approved of. You should forget all the guilt and just get on with it. So the scientific picture is used to remove the guilt, and the free picture, the picture of us as free individuals, is used to commit the sins. It's a jolly good combination.
Oh, that's interesting. So thinking about here, why is it your book, you expound at some length on why evolutionary adaptation, these sorts of scientific ideas, while not wrong, and certainly you're not anti-evolution, but don't add up ultimately to give us a complete understanding of human understanding and of human action and behavior. I mean, even me using the word concept to talk about an evolutionary idea, that in itself could be seen as a contradiction.
Well, this is the basic structure of my argument is that while we are animals and evolved animals, and while the theory of evolution does give a general explanation of our biological makeup, there is an extra to this, but partly because of the complexity of our behavior, we can be understood in a completely different way and interact with each other in a completely different way. It's as though a new reality emerges from the gradual complexity of the biological development. In something like the way, when someone paints a picture, a portrait, say, he dabs pieces of pigment onto a canvas one after another, and you don't know what's happening. It just all looks like bits of pigment on a canvas, and then suddenly a face emerges. You don't know how it happened. It only happened because more bits of pigment were being added, but nevertheless there's a transition into a new level of being, so to speak, when that face appears. Now you can understand this in a completely different way. You understand it using the ideas of the person, of beauty and duty and the meaning of life and so on. All those things which we normally reserve for talking about each other. So I think it's something similar with the human being. At a certain stage of evolutionary development, there emerges what you might call the face of the person on the body of the human.
Well, thinking about this idea, we started with two different concepts. So you talk a lot in the book about the philosopher Immanuel Kant and his notion of rights, of personhood, of autonomy, and of understanding our duties and obligations to others, and also this word of interpersonal, of accountability, and that this is in a way sort of the ground of freedom, or the way to think about freedom. So what is that, though? How then are you at odds with sort of the modern liberal account of personhood, of contract and consent being sort of the sum total of how we relate to other people?
Well, I'm not opposed to the idea that contract and consent are deeply embedded in the human condition, that this is part of what we are, and it's part of what makes it possible for us to solve our problems in the way that animals can't solve their problems. We can solve our problems by agreements, and we can take those agreements to be binding. We can lay down a law that we all consent to, and so on. And we know that this is a fantastic achievement. It means we can live with each other, even if we don't know each other at all. We can live with each other with some kind of guarantee of peace between us. So I would accept that this is part of what is true in the whole liberal inheritance. That we are creatures who settle their problems by contract and consent. But that's not all we are. I mean, I also want to say that we have a deep sense of the meaning of the other person being in some sense sacred to us. We don't have either the right or even the moral possibility of taking another's life away. We stand in a kind of awe towards each other, and we also recognize in the world around us the marks of sacred and forbidden and necessary things. We don't necessarily articulate this in the way that religions do, but there's an urge in all of us towards this, and perhaps to articulate it if we can through art and music and poetry and the rest.
Thinking about something you said, the emergence. You use the term emergent in connection with, say, the human face, or with human language, or the awareness that we're dealing with another subject of emotions, of responses, of accountability. So talk about that for a minute. When you say emergent, is this sort of a dualistic account that's something I lay on top of my body, spirit? Talk about, because there's all sorts of interesting complications, problems there, and I was curious to go. As I was reading your book, I was thinking, what does he mean by emergent? I mean, as I was thinking, that could mean, so Richard Dawkins has his account, but Roger Scruton has his account, and they both seem sufficient for the purposes thereof, but which one's true?
Well, I think by referring to emergent features of the world, I mean that these features emerge from something. The thing that they emerge from is a necessary foundation, but it isn't a sufficient thing to account for what they are. As again, I would say the case of the face emerging from the coloured patches on the canvas is an example of this. You can call this dualism if you like, but I'm inclined to say, as I do in other writings, that that there's a sort of cognitive dualism, that we can understand the world in two ways, but the thing that we're understanding, in one sense as a biological organism, in the other sense as a person, that thing is one thing. It's one thing understood in two ways. And perhaps the simplest example is music. If you're an acoustician, someone who's a real expert on sounds, you might be able to have a complete mastery of how to describe and explain sounds in a sequence, one after another, and you're describing everything that there is. But you might also be tone deaf. You might not hear the melody in those sounds because that's a completely different way of looking at the same thing. So that music is something that we hear in the sounds, but it's nothing more than the sounds. And likewise, the human soul is something that we encounter in the human being, but it's not. But it's nothing more than the human being. But the human being understood in a complete way, so to speak.
Thinking about you talk a lot about the adaptation strategies. I mean, we've had the evolutionary adaptation, anthropology. I don't know, and you talk a lot in the book about how, and you've said here that this gets us so far, and you talk about things in the book that, now they do try and explain everything with this notion, and even this concept of memes. You talk about things like music, laughter, a view, paintings, the experience we have of viewing a painting as things that really can't be explained by evolutionary biology, or at least not in a way that goes toward our, successful survival as a species or as a group. And even something like, you talk about war a little bit, which would seem totally explainable on one level, and yet you talk about which I think is true, the duties and the rights that combatants in a unit share with one another, whereby they overcome even fear itself by duty. So maybe bring out that a little bit, because I think that's on my mind, and that's something that I hear as I travel and talk in various circles. Is the memes approach seems to be really asserting itself.
Right. Well, just hang on a minute. Sorry about that. Yes. This is really difficult because take the case of altruism. We all are familiar now with the evolutionary explanation of altruism. You can give an account in terms of game theory, which shows that genes who produce altruistic avatars, so to speak, have an adaptation which gives them an advantage in the competition for scarce resources. And so, there's an explanation of why it is that animals are altruistic, not only towards their own kin, which would be obvious, but also to the groups in which they find themselves, that they're increasing the survival chances of their genes by doing this. But that doesn't explain in any way what happens when human beings make sacrifices for each other. When a mother sacrifices herself for her child, or a soldier for his comrades in the unit that are fighting, he is doing something because he knows it to be right, or she knows it to be right, and is compelled to make a gift towards others, and knowing the full extent of the cost of this, and yet, as it were, overcoming fear and all the rest in order to do this. It's a completely different motive. It's a motive which, as it were, involves a shining light in front of you, which is pulling you on away from your biological nature towards a higher conception of yourself. And that kind of motive is there all the time in our daily behavior. You might say the result of having this motive is just the same as the result of altruism in animals, and that may be true, but it doesn't explain how it is that we understand it and why it is that we admire each other, condemn each other, and form whole networks of relations on the basis of this kind of motive. So, we've moved into another sphere. That's what I would want to say. And that other sphere has a logic of its own.
Thinking here, it seems to me, one a problem as I was reading your account is, it seems to me the power, though, of the evolutionary understanding is science itself, and really the power of science, the authoritative way science speaks, in which we understand it, as democratic members of modernity. I mean, this is something that we all sort of listen to, and we're always keen to study show, and we sort of adjust ourselves in the light thereof. And I guess with evolution, what I'm trying to say is there's a scientific grounding there supporting these various writers that you discuss in your book, E.O. Wilson, others. And yet your account, your primary authority, I take it, is Immanuel Kant. And I guess the sort of my question to you is, so what's your quote unquote scientific authority that supports what you're saying here? Because when I hear you say emergent, are you saying these sort of spatial, immaterial qualities like love or sacredness or awe or freedom, that they emerge out of the material person, or do they come from somewhere else?
I would say they emerge out of the material reality. Whether they also come from something else is a big cosmological question about the whole world, and I don't have an answer to that, not in this book anyway. But I would say, look, I don't have to have, on my view, a rival science of the human being. I accept what all these scientists say, as long as they confine themselves to the actual implications of their theories. But of course people always get excited by their theories and run on with them, thinking that now they have the solution to the next thing and the next thing, and overstep the mark. And that's we see around us all the time. Because we can explain human altruism as an evolutionarily stable strategy, it follows that really there's no such thing as human virtue or whatever, and people rush on to amend their whole worldview on the basis of a very slender fact. It's a bit as though, if you suddenly discovered, as Helmholtz did, that all the harmonies of tonal music can be understood in terms of the sine waves of the vibrations that make the pitched, the various pitches. Give an explanation in terms of the way in which sine waves fit into each other, so that they don't beat against each other and so on. You give a complete account. You say, "No, I've understood tonal music. I see what explains it." There's no need for me to listen to what a musicologist says about the real dynamics of a Beethoven quartet, and that, of course, would be nonsense. We know that the scientific theory of tonal harmony gets us just so far. It doesn't get us to that use of tonal harmony in which the human spirit is embodied.
So in a way, it's almost as if we're alienated from ourselves, in that the ways that we understand ourselves to be.
That is the danger with what is sometimes called scientism. Science without the modesty which science demands. And I think, and that's all I would say in response to this kind of view that science has said everything. Namely, it never claimed to say everything. It claims to give a causal explanation, and it tries its hardest to do that, and doesn't. We haven't got the full story yet, but it doesn't claim to give the meaning of things. That's a completely different form of understanding.
You talk a lot about in the book on freedom, ways in which we know we're free. One of which you say is language, and communicating with other people about our actions or trying to understand their actions or how they understand our actions. And a question I wanted to ask you when I think was reading that was, what about the mind of modern man, which is, I think it's safe to say, has a nominalistic understanding of language? That this is a deeply willed phenomenon we're engaged in. We'll just, I mean, there's also the evolutionary account of language. I think we've talked a lot about that, but this sort of nominalism, that language doesn't really describe essences or forms of things. It can't. It's just sort of something we tell ourselves. We give a name to something, and of course the deeper consequences here are understanding our actions to be largely relative, and so there's no real content or meaning to what we're doing, or to what we're saying we're doing.
This is a big question in the philosophy of language, and I'm not myself a nominalist, and I don't. I don't have a complete theory of language by any means, but I would say the most fundamental fact about language is that in its primary use, it's an attempt to describe how things are. In other words, it's subject to the discipline of truth-seeking, and a successful sentence is one that is true to the facts. That's what I would say. I know that's the classical anti-nominalist position, but I don't think you can get away from it. Why else did we ever bother to speak if it weren't to communicate about the facts? Of course, there's lots of other uses of language as well, but one particular thing that I wanted to say is this, that when we learn the language of our mental states, the language to refer to ourselves, to each other, as thinking, believing, wanting, desiring, fearing, etc., all the ways in which we try and grasp other people in terms of their mental motivation. When we develop that language, there's an interesting byproduct, which is namely the pronoun. I learn to describe myself using the word I. I say, I fear this, I want that, etc. And then I learn to describe you, not as he or she, but as you. And out of that, there emerges this extraordinary thing, the I to you dialogue, in which people exchange views about their states of mind, exchange their states of mind with each other directly without having to find out anything, just by expressing it through language. And this completely changes the structure of human relations, in my view. That's one of my arguments. It takes us out of the relations that are within the sphere of ordinary animals into another sphere entirely, in which we stand face to face, eye to you, or if you like, eye to eye, and deal with each other in completely different terms. And that's part of what freedom consists in. But it's a gift, of course, of the language and of this strange articulation of the language, which comes about through pronouns.
The first person plural, you don't write about it in this book, but in other books, I'm very familiar with you arguing that the first person plural is really the basis of political obligations and civic freedoms, and also loyalty to a public thing, to a political order.
Yeah.
And you situate that too within the context of the nation state, which is sort of the political form we Westerners have arrived at, but which has its critics, as you know. Maybe talk some about that, because I think people aren't aware of, or should be more aware of, that argument for the nation state, as opposed to sort of the endless, the social contract, natural rights arguments we know so well.
Yeah. Well, I take the view that every political organization depends upon a pre-political attachment. Just as in a family, all the discussions about what we should do, how we should deal with this problem, how we should, where we should go on holiday, etc. All these discussions presuppose that we are together in this place. This is our home, and we're making a go of it. In the same way, all the discussions that make up politics depend upon the assumption that we who are engaged in them belong together in some other way. That we're here by destiny. We're part of, as you say, a first-person plural, which enables us to say we. And I would say there's lots of ways in which people can get to a first-person plural. I might say we Muslims or we Christians, and that's a very familiar way of identifying a first-person plural, but it's an old way and one that we've moved largely beyond. If we start talking about we Americans, then we're talking much more about our residence in a single geopolitical region, and not just residence, but the grant of citizenship that comes from that. And that's what the nation state consists in, a transfer of loyalty from things like religion, family, tribe, dynasty and all that, to this other thing, the country being both the territory and the law and the citizenship that have molded that territory as ours. And I think that's a huge achievement. It's the way in which Europe freed itself from the wars of religion in the 17th century by redefining itself in terms of the nation state. It went wrong in the 20th century, not because the nation state is a bad idea, but because the nation state was taken over by these totalitarian and nationalist doctrines, which are actually a perversion of the idea of the nation state.
Yeah, no. So there we.
Yeah.
No, I don't want to interrupt you, but I was thinking, the first person plural is a way of sort of adding something to a social contract understanding. So I don't take it that you would be denying the opportunities of constitutional foundings or subsequent foundings of a country, but it's that we wouldn't come together to begin with if there wasn't already this first person plural thing joining us. Yeah.
The American Constitution makes it clear. It says, "We, the people of the United States." That's how it begins, as I recall, isn't it?
Yes.
You say, who do you mean we? And it's so obvious. We are here together. That's destiny has brought us together in the way as it brings a family together. So we know that we're committed to each other. Now we're going to build on that and experiment with a constitution and a procedure. But you can't have the constitution and the procedure without having first defined the first person plural to whom it is to attach. And this is the great weakness of the political philosophy of people like Rawls. Rawls starts off from a social contract, but doesn't realize that he already should have defined the particular pre-political group who is engaging in that contract. In the end, he will have to say, well, it's everyone, but everyone where? And then it all peters out in vagueness and sentimentality.
So your point is, with respect to John Rawls, how do we know who gets to go behind the veil of ignorance?
Yeah, absolutely.
Who chooses them? They choose them. They confer it on each other.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah.
So this is what, in my view, when we understand this, the importance of the first person plural in politics, we begin to see the point of the nation state and how it's not a retrogressive thing, but actually a progressive thing from the point of view of our Western history.
Well, it might also help us think about a lot of other incredibly difficult to discuss issues, like immigration, or things like free trade, and the importance and significance of borders, and help us to discuss those in ways that sort of dislodge sort of the instant xenophobia or racist comments we hear. I mean, not that there aren't those elements in these debates or people who are acting from those motives, but that this isn't something nefarious. That the first person plural, to the extent it brings in other people, it will be because they have agreed to the same terms that we're in.
It is a very complex matter, this, of course. And you can only include people in your first person plural if you also have a sense of excluding them. If you say it's just everyone, anywhere, then in effect you haven't got a we. It all fragments into little I's. It's only if you're really determined to maintain it as a first-person plural that you can actually offer to the immigrant anything that he wants. He wants to belong. Or if he doesn't want to belong, as so many of the Islamists in Europe don't, then of course you have the option of sending him home.
Yeah. Well, thinking about, you talk some about responsibility and blame and guilt. And I guess in a way this discussion in a way opens us to thinking about you're writing about language, responsibility and blame and guilt not being arbitrary constructs or things that are put upon us by various authorities, but that are deeply, according to your view, deeply enmeshed in us as is freedom.
Yeah.
And accountability.
That's right. I want to say in the end that the concept of freedom gets its sense from our activities of praising, blaming, taking responsibility, calling others to account, and so on. That these activities all are of a piece, and they're all centered on the idea that we each are responsible to each other for what we do. And the concept of freedom is a kind of all-embracing posture towards each other, which is implicit in those ways of talking about the world.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I don't want.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't want to give a metaphysical account of freedom. I don't want to say that free actions are, as it were, outside the natural order. There are interventions from the spiritual realm or something like that. I think that is nonsense, or if it's not nonsense, it's not of any use to us. I want to say that the concept of freedom is like the concept of a melody. It's describing the material in a completely different way so that it becomes part of our dialogue with each other.
That's interesting because now you say you're not interested in a metaphysical account of freedom. You do have an interesting discussion towards the end of the book, which I thought sort of opened up, maybe not to a metaphysical account, but you talked about morals and faith and evil. And I guess as I read that, and this, this wasn't your argument, this is Richard's imposition on your argument, opening up freedom for what? Freedom for what end? For what purposes? And it seems that involves questions both of nature, is there a nature, and also what's the ground of that? Could it be God? Could it be I'm participating in the personhood of God with my freedom? And I wanted to ask you that, and I feel like you have to answer it. But specifically your dialogue on morals and faith, you hinted at this notion of the sacred, and the sacred. You were saying it just sort of hits us. It erupts from somewhere, and we know it, but we can't necessarily give great detailed account of it. We do lyrically, poetically, etc. But it's just we know we're not in our time in the same way. Yeah.
Yes. Gosh, this is all very difficult. I touch on this in the other book, The Soul of the World, and I would like to say that in our approach to each other, in the I to you relation, there's an element of what I call overreaching intentionality. We aim beyond what we immediately encounter in the physical world, the body and words and gestures of the other, to their transcendental source, the place from which you view me, so to speak. Now that place is not a place in my world. I couldn't occupy it without being you. So that, and we're all in this predicament that we're, as it were, confronting other people and trying to address them in a place to which we have no actual access. But yet we live with this because we recognize that we are centers of consciousness who address each other from these transcendental positions. And this, I think, means that our whole worldview is instilled with this notion that there is a beyond from which the world as a whole is addressed. And I think that is the origin of the God idea, or the right form of the God idea, and it's implicit actually in the very beginning of the Bible, in Moses' encounter with God in the burning bush. Just that sense, as God says, "I am that I am." All that Moses encounters is, as it were, that transcendental point of view which is addressing him. That's all he knows. And yet he's certain that he is being addressed. And I think that's where the true religious attitude comes from, that certainty that you're being addressed from a place beyond.
Yeah, is this also in a way related? So we'll step down maybe from the metaphysical sphere a little bit here, and just think about contract and consent. And we've talked some about the loyalty to the nation state as a part of who we are, the first person plural. You also write some in this book and a lot in other writings about sort of the paucity of contract and consent, not take as being the sole understanding of human relationships, not being able to take into account the intergenerational perspective. But this, I take it, is also a part of personhood, an awareness of who we are, has historical beings, and also as beings who raise children, and these are like unchosen obligations that we have to somehow make sense of.
Yeah, I would say that's a very important point. I would say that we persons we exist in time in another way from the animals. Time does not have for us that sense of the succession of moments, one after another, which vanish as soon as they've been enjoyed. And for us, time, we're constantly aware of time stretching before and after, and of this moment as somehow a challenge to join that past and that future together. And so we live in time in a completely different way, and time becomes a kind of mystery to us for that reason. And so we yearn to escape from it in the way that no animal could conceivably yearn to escape from it. And this informs our sense of our obligations, and in particular our sense that obligations stretch back before our birth and forward after our death. We're only one fragment of the whole network of obligations, within which we're, as it were, suspended throughout our lives.
So thinking about that, so we're trying to escape time. You're saying time is intimately a part of us, and we know this, and it's sort of informed, so it is shaping us in a way. So this also sort of adds, I think, perspective to human community, and how human community is formed and who's allowed to be into it. I was thinking also maybe we have saved the best for last. You have a section on evil. And revulsion, and this is sort of also related to the exceptional human person. Maybe we can end by talking about that and how the negation of evil points towards all the things we've been describing as the good aspect of human freedom.
Well, yes, I think many people find evil very difficult to understand because they see morality in the manner of Peter Singer and people like that as, a kind of cost-benefit calculation.
Did you see
some
Peter
things have a cost?
I was going to say, Peter Singer this week, earlier this week, apparently argued the moral acceptability of raping someone who was severely handicapped, who couldn't give their consent. Did you see that?
Well, I mean, he paints himself into impossible corners, of course. But, this cost-benefit vision comes up against all kinds of difficulties. And one difficulty is the evil person. We think of the evil person as I say, in some sense, a visitor from the beyond. He is not really part of this world. He has he's an embodiment of the principle of negation. He wants to undo the work of creation, so to speak. And this you get actually in sexual matters very much. The rapist is somebody who is undoing the created presence of the other person. Her freedom and her existence as a self-conscious being is of nothing to him. He wants to annihilate them almost, to reduce her to his slave and to the enslavement of her own body. And everybody feels this as a kind of desecration. And that idea that the human reality can be desecrated is fundamental to our full moral experience, and it's a proof of the fact that we all live with a concept of the sacred inside us somewhere. But how can something be desecrated if it isn't also consecrated? And there are people who rampage through this world with no sense of the sacred, or if they encounter the sacred, wanting immediately to desecrate it. And that was the real meaning of the concentration camps and the death camps. They were about reducing the human being to a desecrated remnant of himself, so he could be discarded like a dead insect. And I think that sense that evil is a kind of metaphysical visitation is something that we all have, and it compels us to understand it in the sort of way that I think these things should be understood, not as a merely animal or calculating phenomenon, but as something which stands apart in just the way that the human person as a whole stands apart.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I was reading that part in the book, I was thinking of studying the criminal law of rape when I was in law school, and virtually every state in the United States committed rape to a capital offense, or you judged it as a capital offense. You lost your life for it. And then the Supreme Court, in a rather strange opinion, I always thought, said it was a violation of cruel and unusual punishments of the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, and it can no longer be given such. Now, I mean, I suppose, mistaken identities, maybe that's a good thing. I don't know. But the question in my mind as I was reading your book was, I wonder why we did that. And I think you're after the reason why we did that. And because of this loss that it involves. It's not just a beating or being, pushed off the road and beaten and your wallet stolen. There's something else taken there.
Yeah.
I know.
It's an existential violation.
Yeah, but it's interesting thinking too, just hearing you talk. So all sexual relations are now reduced to consent. Can consent bear the weight? The way you write it. The way you write
it. Yeah, of course it can't. You need those other concepts of purity and desecration and so on in order to see what is really at stake. And this is something which I bring out in my novel, The Disappeared, of course, which is about rape. But that's another matter.
Yeah, no, you discussed it on the program. You might remember when it came out. That was interesting. No, I remember that very well. Roger, thank you so much for your time today, for discussing your book on human nature. It's really been a pleasure.
And for me, thank you very much.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.